Well, welcome to Wealth Without Barriers. My name is Casey Mushrash. I'm joined today by Scott Klon, and today we're going to be talking about your money, the things that are important to you, and the things that you need to do to put yourself into the best financial position that you can be for your future. And we're really going to be talking about common mistakes that affluent Americans make with their money, and more importantly, how to avoid them. But before we get into that, Scott, how you been?
I've been pretty well. How about you?
Good. Oh, we're doing real good. It's it's officially swim season, so we've been trying to go to the swimming pool every night, which that has been rather interesting.
So do you get a public membership?
Yeah,
for
so we
the pools?
just have a public pass or a pool pass down over there. Well, we live like 4 blocks from one of the city pools.
That's nice.
So so we just everybody gets a pool pass for the summer, and then we can just go run down and and it's not even like I was talking with my wife about this last night. It's about that routine more so than anything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Eat dinner, go to the pool, come home, do final fill up. That's what we call it.
Oh, yeah.
Final fill up, get ready for bed, and then go to sleep. And so just trying to get back into that summer routine to make sure that we have that stuff just to keep the kids kind of on, okay, well, we've got these things that we're going to do, and then we need to start winding down because my kids are very energetic.
Yeah, when you got a lot of them too. So
well, and it's there's no signs of that stopping. So as far as the energy in the household, I guess I should specify that.
oh yeah, I was like, she's gonna have more kids.
As far as I'm aware, not at this time.
Okay.
So
All right. Good. Yep.
Ask me again in like another year or two, because that seems to be the cycle.
We'll see. All right.
Anyway. Any big exciting things happening in your life though?
No, not really. The funny thing is I just went out for lunch beforehand, and I've seen these on TV, or not on TV, but just in like ads and stuff. I actually saw a motorized lawnmower where it's out there operating by itself. It was just it was just about 2 blocks away. I didn't realize that anybody ever really bought those things.
Okay, but, like the actual robotic
ones. It was kind of neat to see, just because I was like, I'd never seen one of those in person.
Never seen one. I've never seen one in operation. I got the Facebook ads like what was that, a year ago, I think, when there was a bunch of them that they were trying to come over to the market.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, I was like, I don't even mow my own lawn anyway as it is right now, so why am I getting these?
Well, yeah. Well, and I live in a townhouse and an association, and I mean, I don't think you could ever get me back into a regular house just because it's so nice to come home on like a Thursday and, the lawn was mowed.
Oh, somebody had taken care of.
Yeah. I love that aspect of it. I think lawn care and even doing landscaping and stuff like that is therapeutic, but when you don't have time to do it, it can be a real hassle.
So the best $20 I've ever spent in my life was on my lawn. And it was a couple of kids were going out around the neighborhood. Well, when I say a couple of kids, it was like a gang of like 5. And so they had 2 different mowers and all that kind of thing, but they were probably, I don't know, I would say the age ranges were somewhere between like 7 and 10. Okay. Because it was like a couple of brothers and a couple of other brothers and a couple of other brothers, and they were going out mowing lawns and all that kind of thing. And they had the mower deck like tilted sideways. So like my lawn looked terrible. Like it just like it was a hack job as far as that was, but it was hilarious watching them go through it because they had the one that was the foreman telling what they were all to do. And so I stood out and watched them out the front window. Best $20 I've ever spent in my life. It was absolutely phenomenal. So they got done with like the front part of the lawn, and they came and knocked on the door because like we'd had this negotiation, $25 or whatever it was for the lawn. And they get done with the front part, and they say, "Can we be done?" And I looked at this kid, and I was thinking, "Boy, son, you just learned a very valuable lesson in market pricing."
Yeah, you did.
But we fed them. They got pretty hot. But so it cost me like $20 to get the lawn done. And again, with a mower deck that was sideways, so I had to go back and redo it again later. And then it was 8 popsicles and like 6 Gatorades or something like that by the time we were done. But it was our afternoon entertainment. Best $20 I've ever spent in my life.
I bet it was, yeah.
So as we get over into today's subject matter, and I kind of mentioned that really what we're going to be talking about is mistakes that affluent Americans make when it actually comes over to their money. Now, I would say that maybe one of the different challenges in this is we might need to define terms just a touch. When we say an affluent American, I mean, that could mean a lot of different things, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of different definitions that may be applicable on that. Especially again, we're going to kind of consolidate this down to United States, and I'd even say contiguous to United States more than anything else. But inside the United States, as far as the affluent Americans, I mean, if you look at it comparatively, the U.S. I don't care who you are in the U.S. Even poor people are affluent when it comes over to the global population, right? So we're going to be looking at it strictly based off of United States. And what looks like wealth to one person might not necessarily be the same to others. And sometimes we might see what appears to be wealth, right, or appears to be this appearance of affluence, but it's really driven by a lot of debt and things on that side. So doesn't necessarily mean that people that have necessarily high income are in that affluent structure. Maybe they have a lot of cash flow, but maybe everything's coming in and then everything's heading out the door. So a net worth of $500,000 might make you, just as an example, that might make you affluent if you have a $500,000 net worth. If you're maybe in somewhere, maybe further in the South, but if you're living in California or New York, as an example, where cost of living is a lot higher, that is going to have a very, there's going to be a very different nominal experience with that overall net worth and that pool of dollars that are actually available.
Okay.
So if we look at Equitable, they say the mass affluent, making $90,000 a year or more, and I think that's probably going to be, something that we look at as far as a definition that we're going to be taking a look at.
Yeah, and I think that actually seems low, for affluent.
Sure.
I mean, if you're a single person, maybe, but it seems to me like it wouldn't stretch very far if it was a couple or a family.
Right. Well, and I think really if you look over on there, because I think the last time I saw some of the survey data, it was the median household income in the United States is something like $60,000, somewhere over on that side. So, I mean, you're talking about another, call another 30% on top of what that is, just in terms of nominal dollars. So I think it definitely sticks us over into about that top, maybe 30% of income earners. Before we're kind of touching on that. But no, I agree with you. And again, I think it probably depends a lot on where you're located, right? $90,000 in San Francisco, that's a completely different, that's a completely different conversation than $90,000 in rural Iowa, right? So, I think that does kind of exactly to, kind of what you were pointing out on there. It kind of depends a little bit on location can be very heavily dependent on what we're utilizing from a definition standpoint.
Yep.
But according to a survey by Equitable, about 80% of people making $90,000 or more have some concerns about the affordability of everyday living cost.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're talking mortgage, we're talking groceries, we're talking the everyday things, and I mean that's not an insignificant percentage of respondents.
No, and I mean I think recently, because we have seen a spike in inflation,
Sure.
As far as that with groceries and all that. But, I'm going to reveal how cheap I am, a little bit here because, Sunday I got an email, from one of our local grocery store chains that, if you spend $60, you get 50 cents off on your gas, which I think is a genius thing that this grocery store did, was because people are more concerned about the price of gas than they are the price of groceries.
Right.
To do that. But, anyway, so Shelley usually does not work on Monday and goes grocery shopping. I said, so, why don't you go to this store and at least spend $60 to do that? And then so we both go to the gas station together because it's 20 gallons that you did. So we're being cheap and we're maximizing
pull one in and then pull into the next vehicle.
So usually she pulls in first. I fill up her vehicle, and then she pulls out and parks, and then I stand there and hold it, and she holds it while I pull my car in, and then I finish the 20 gallons with my vehicle.
That's incredible, by the way.
I mean, we only live 1.5 miles away from the gas station, so it's just like, okay, let's go ahead and do that. Well. So anyway, she drives off, and I'm finishing and filling up my car, and I'm just looking around, and I see the lottery sign, and the Mega Millions was 200 million or more, and I was like, I could use that. So I walked in after I got done filling up my tank, and I don't buy lottery tickets very often because the probability of you
Right.
winning is next to none.
So if you're not here next week, we know what happened. Is that the
Well, the drawing was last night, and I'm still here. So but anyway, that's up to $5 now. Last time I bought one, it was $2, and just so even lottery tickets have gone up substantially in price. It just seems like everything is almost like taking advantage of you a little bit, because we do see inflation a little bit. So I mean, I think 80% is probably a low, on the low side.
Yeah.
So,
No, I find that I kind of find that the anecdotal stories are funny, but I do think you're spot on. Just from a standpoint that even mathematically it's based off that, right? Because you take a look at inflation prior to 2020, there was none. I mean, we're talking like inflation over the course of from 2010 to 2020, inflation was what, 1.8% or something like that. It was just basically non-existent. Like we were sub 2%. And then you fast forward over to what happened, especially after COVID with some of the different, the price shocks and, the different supply chain shocks and all those kinds of things where we saw some pretty massive inflation in 2020 that was north of 9%. Now it's backed off pretty significantly since that point. But again, I think that goes over to how inflation is measured, right? So even we saw that CPI print here not too long ago that I think was 2.4% or something like that is what the year-over-year price increases were, which is relatively similar to what the Fed is kind of targeting. Now they're looking at PCE, not CPI, right? But even with that being said, it's not sitting there at 9. However, that doesn't mean the prices have dropped. Right? Inflation is measured year over year. What was prices a year ago? What are prices this year? So if they've only gone up by 2%, oh, hey, headline inflation has actually improved. But if we are still reflecting some of those earlier price shocks, some of those increases, and we never actually saw deflation where those prices drop back down, then at that point in time, it would still remain elevated, and it starts to cut in over from a cash flow standpoint. So no, I think you're absolutely spot on, at least when it comes over to recognizing that we see that detrimental effect in terms of that day-to-day spending. And it's been exacerbated, I think, over the last couple of years, probably more so than anything else, last 3, 4, 5 years. Doesn't make it any more fun. Just because there is a mathematical answer doesn't mean that it's pleasant.
Yeah. Well, it definitely doesn't make it more fun. I mean, because, it's just bottom line is, things that are costing more than 100% more than what they used to be, 2 or 3 years ago. It's prohibitive to do some things. And, again, $5 versus $2. But, when you're looking at the odds of winning, it's one of those things that I'm not going to do that anymore,
Yep.
So.
No, for sure.
But
kind of the number one mistake, we're going to kind of get over into there. So we kind of talked about a couple of things on that side. But the number one item that we have here is underestimating income taxes. So again, go back over to the definition that we were taking a look at as far as the mass affluent being over that $90,000 of income. Now, if we look at the way the tax code is written, and this will vary depending on whether it's an individual and whether it's a married jointly. Now, I see that you have tax tables in front of you.
I do, because I was curious to see. Okay, well, what is affluent tax break?
So where does that put people in terms of like the current tax code? Now, I'm not going to say projected into whether or not the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires, but in today's 2025 tax code, where would somebody fall at, depending on what their tax filing status was?
So basically, if they're a single status and it's 90,000, if that's our threshold, that's going to fall into the 22% tax bracket. It's very, very close to the 24, but it's still the 22. But if you're married filing jointly, which is probably one of the more common ones, that actually falls into the top part of the 12% tax bracket. And so, that's another reason why I was thinking, okay, well, 90,000 seems like it's pretty low because it's on the lower side of the tax table because, you're looking at 37% as the top of that table.
Right.
So,
Yeah, but but it kind of to one thing that you're mentioning on there is that is right at the line where any additional income or anything else that gets added on there, that's going to push up to a higher tax bracket at that point.
That's true.
And so, it's I think that even with that overall estimate, and I mean the other way to look at it too is if we look at $90,000 on that, is that just for a single person or is that for a household, right?
Mhm.
Now, if we're saying $90,000 as an individual, and we have two individuals, so we have $180,000. Now we're going to be over in that 22% marginal bracket pretty solidly. Possibly even where do we hit? It's 200 and
206 is the top of the 22%.
Yeah.
And so anything over 206 would
That's
be
when
the
you get over
24%.
24.
Yeah.
Yep. So even if you're looking at it as an individual standpoint, which is another way that you can do that. So if you had two households that combine, so they reach $90,000 and then they combine, right? Because you marry into your same economic status or socioeconomic status, so to speak. Then you're still pretty solidly over within that 22% marginal bracket. Now that does not mean that you owe 22% of the 180 or the 90 in terms of what your overall income tax liability is going to be.
Right.
So it is a graduated or a marginal rate, okay, a marginal rate of 22%. But that could be that could be a little bit of a shock if let's say for example we have somebody with relatively disparate incomes that ends up getting married together, right? So maybe we've got someone that is an individual, they're making call it $200,000, and then we've got somebody else that they were making maybe 30.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, that 30,000 individual is going to be in a 10% marginal bracket. You've got your other person over at a 22% marginal bracket, and then when you add those together, now all of a sudden we're at a 24% marginal bracket. Right. So we've pushed ourselves over into a higher tax liability because of that union over from that. Just based off of those really rough estimate those numbers on that side. So it is something that we want to make sure that. Taxes are kind of a really interesting thing because we don't want to necessarily overpay. We also don't want to necessarily underpay, right? If I underpay by certain thresholds, then I owe interest, I owe penalties. So I want to make sure that I minimize that as much as possible. However, if I overpay on my taxes, I over withhold, then I'm just giving the government an interest-free loan for a year.
Mm-hmm.
So, the tax liability on as far as trying to get an accurate estimate on what that's actually going to look like, it will have an impact or a follow-on effect on what we do from an overall withholding standpoint. Now, we didn't even get into, the tax liability on the differences between if you're self-employed versus if you're working somewhere, meaning that you're fully responsible for all of the payroll taxes if you're self-employed versus if you're only responsible for one half of it if you're W-2 underneath some sort of a other employment engagement with another employer.
Well, and I think also, we deal with a lot of retirees too, and underestimating the taxes there,
Right.
because they may think, okay, well, I am affluent, I've got a $500,000 net worth, but depending on what retirement vehicle it's in, is it really $500,000?
Right.
And so, and I think that runs into, well, I guess it's the next one, but. If you're just looking at monthly income versus a newer expenditure like a new car or something like that, that really factors in. That if I need $50,000 for a car, how much do I actually have to take out of my IRA account to get that $50,000?
Right, yeah, because what you're saying is a pre-tax account, in order to net that $50,000, might have a significantly higher cost compared to a different vehicle like a non-retirement account or a Roth IRA,
Right.
something of that nature. If I can pull out 50 and it actually is 50 and it doesn't increase my taxable income, might not necessarily be a bad thing compared to, well, I actually have to pull out 80 to net 50 so that I can go spend it.
Yeah. Well, and that usually, I mean, if it's on top of your regular income, you're looking at, okay, well, that's in a new bracket.
Right.
I mean, part of that 50,000 is going to now get taxed at 24% versus the rest of my income is at 12 and 22%.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, and it does create kind of some interesting, I'm going to call it, one-off tax planning scenarios that I know that I deal with periodically and that you do as well, which is, okay, well, we know we have this expenditure that we're coming out. We're pulling it out of this account for whatever the reason is. Rather than just do the standard withholding that we have, maybe we've got like a 10% tax withholding or something like set up for the monthly income distributions. We know we have this one-time distribution coming out. But instead of withholding 10 that we have set up on that account, we're going to have you execute a single time that we're going to withhold 15 or we're going to withhold 20 in order to make sure we don't under withhold on that tax. And so you don't have a surprise tax bill when it comes over to April when you actually file your taxes at that point in time. Yeah. Assuming you're filing late and you're not like one of these people that wants to get it done on February 2nd.
Well, yeah. Well, and the other thing too, and I just had this conversation yesterday. I mean, he's 60 years old, and at 63, that's when he wants to retire. Mm-hmm. And so we were talking about an extra, probably about $10,000 a year that he should save. Should he save it into his 403B plan, or should he do a Roth? Well, the next comment that came out of his mouth is, well, the car that I drive to work every day has 300,000 miles on it. So when I retire, I would like to buy a new truck. Mm-hmm. And so it was almost immediately, well, maybe we should put that money aside in a Roth IRA so you can just pull it out to do that. So
we can set up the income plan, and the overall taxes are not going to come and rake you over the coals when you have that part year income, part year distribution, because you're going to have to replace that vehicle.
Yes. Exactly.
It's almost like there's a plan that has to be developed in order to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. And that plan will come to fruition on the appointment we got scheduled 2 weeks from now.
I love it. That's awesome. So that number 2 item that we have as far as the mistakes, right? Mm-hmm. And again, I think kind of actually just back up as far as that underestimating the income taxes. We talked about this or alluded to it, just making sure that you're working with various different professionals or you're understanding what the actual tax implications of your decisions are so that you can actually have the appropriate withholding. That's really kind of the solution on that side. The number 2 item, so mistakes that affluent Americans make with their money. Big ticket purchases without considering the related costs. Mm-hmm. Now, we kind of went through already and talked about the taxes, but that's not the only thing that may come over into play. So, maybe we're looking at a bigger ticket item, like maybe it's a new house, right, or a second vacation home, or maybe it's a larger car or something like that. You're mentioning that just a couple seconds.
Mm-hmm. Well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that these do typically come with higher ongoing maintenance or higher carrying costs. Mm-hmm. And so we have to make sure that we factor that into the equation to see whether or not it is something that is viable within the economic reality that we dwell within.
Yeah. Well, like for example, with the house, I believe that this is true after holding on to a house for quite a while, and I think it came from a property casualty insurance company that you should set aside about 4% of the value mm-hmm. to maintain that particular piece of property. And, again, it's not a 4% on an annual basis, but, mm-hmm. I'm looking at new flooring in a house and, we're probably looking at about $16,000 to $20,000 to, put new carpet and new types of flooring. Mm-hmm. It might even be more than that, but that's kind of what I'm estimating at this point.
Right.
Well, the first 16 years, I didn't have that expenditure, but now it's all going to come all at once to mm-hmm. to do that. But it boils down into when you do buy an additional house, a bigger house, and all that other type of stuff, your maintenance costs are going to increase along with that.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and it's really trying to make sure that even whether it's the funding mechanism as far as additional tax withholding because of where the funds are at, right? Mm-hmm. Everything's in a pre-tax account. It's going to trigger taxation. Right. Yes. And that's why one of the things that we talk about with clients oftentimes comes over into, maybe, we have no difference between these scenarios between whether you save it here or whether you save it here, like the ability to create income over the course of a 30 or 40 or whatever that period of time is. Statistically, it's exactly the same. However, let's look at creating that tax diversification because we might have some of these items that we're not necessarily anticipating, and maybe you can look out and say, yep, we know we got some new floors, but I will say that doing doing flooring inside of a townhouse, right, which you're talking mm-hmm. about, a little bit different than if you live in like a 6-bed, 5-bath style home as well. Probably a few more square footage that we're going to be needing to take into effect, with something on that side. So, thinking about the overall cost, right? That's really what we want to make sure that we're considering anytime that there's some sort of a very large purchase that's going to happen. Now, vehicles are kind of interesting, simply from the standpoint that if you go buy a new vehicle, theoretically, right? Now, this again, theoretically, you're not going to have as much, repair costs, right? That maybe
Right.
you're not going to necessarily have the repair costs you would with an older vehicle or something of that nature on that side. However, if you got a brand new car and the engine goes out on the thing and you're replacing that because it makes more sense to do that than it is to just replace the entire vehicle as it is, there is a cost differential between these two things for sure. So understanding what that overall total cost is that's over on that. Now that kind of gets over into this whole other thing on when does it make sense to actually fully replace a vehicle versus continuing to repair it. At what point is the percentage of the repair based off of what the current value that it makes more sense to repair versus continuing to just replace that vehicle as it is. That might be an entire topic one of these days.
And it's an entire topic that I don't even know if I have the correct answers to.
I don't think there is a correct answer.
Well, I don't think there is a correct answer, but I mean, I've gone back and forth in my own head for that. And, I developed my own little rules as far as that goes, but they're not hard and fast correct with things. But I mean, my philosophy is, and I just did a search. That's how I came up with it, as what's the average vehicle last. And they say 12 years on the road. So, that's my mindset. I'm going to keep a car 12 years and that. But then I also, when I did replace my 13-year-old vehicle, I was adding up all my repair costs, and then I looked at the Kelley Blue Book value, and it was less than what my repair cost was. So I was like, okay, it's time to replace this vehicle.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's several different theories that are out there, at least when it comes over to vehicle replacement, and I think it probably depends very much on whether you are if you're a gearhead or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you're doing some of your own work and all that other type of stuff,
I have a client that I told him he's like one of the only people I've ever known that has actually made money on vehicles, like on his vehicles.
Yeah.
It's because he does all the work himself. He kind of laughed. He goes, "Yeah, Casey, it's because I do my own work. Like otherwise, there's no way we would actually be making money on these things." Now that being said, he's also a classic car collector. And so, he's not going and buying Honda Accords.
Right. Well, and the thing of it is you almost have to buy classic if you want to do your own work.
Right.
Because, they've gotten to the point with cars where, a special tool just to be able to pull a spark plug out is, incredible. But I mean, the repair cost on vehicle, or the labor cost for repair of a vehicle has just gone crazy upward.
Well, that and I think definitely design on it. So, I still maintain best car we ever owned was that 88 Oldsmobile Cup Sierra, Old Geraldine, greatest car. One of the worst one was actually a Chrysler 300M. So I had an issue with it was with the serpentine belt. Actually, just needed to replace the alternator belt. It was fine. It was just kind of a little bit squeaky, got worn out, and all that kind of stuff. In order to replace that, had to disconnect the radiator in order to replace the serpentine belt. Now, in my wisdom, and this is back when we were my wife and I were living in an apartment, had no money and all that kind of thing. I was like, I can go do that. I mean, it takes maybe a couple hours or something like that. Oh no, that car sat there for 4 days because I figured that entire thing out. I was like, who designed this thing? Oh, it was awful.
Yeah.
So there is definitely a cost.
Yeah. Well, and
those things as well.
The days are over because I remember in high school. I mean, I bought my first car for $1,000 on lawn mowing money, and whenever I had something go wrong with it, we figured it out, and I got my auto shop buddies, to come up, and we went to the parts store and pulled it in my parents' garage and fixed it. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing half the time, but at least I had somebody that did. Did maybe get a C in the class or something. but yeah, I mean, those days are over. I don't even bother, looking at my engine anymore. So.
Yep. Oh, very good. So, kind of that other next mistake we've got on here as far as our third item. Well, I guess did we answer that as far as I don't know if I answered that or not. big ticket purchases. So, really, again, I think kind of the answer to that, right? So make sure that you understand what the actual total cost of whatever that purchase is. So factor in those carrying costs if it's higher taxes. Take, for example, higher property taxes if we're looking at a piece of real estate. Maybe higher maintenance costs if we're looking at maybe a premium vehicle or something of that nature. But understand what the actual or the true cost of that item is rather than, well, this is just the sales price that we see as far as today. So the next item we have is as far as one of the top 4 money mistakes that we see, not increasing the savings and the investment rates when income actually rises. And I would not just say this is a problem for the affluent or the mass affluent. I think this is a problem that we see regardless of where somebody is actually at. So if they're a high income earner, they're a middle income earner, or a low income earner, but being able to save additional money or putting additional savings over in place or savings mechanisms in place when we see that that income actually increase. So one of the great things about it is that you do get additional income. However, if your expenses stay the same, you now have additional disposable or additional discretionary cash. But what we have a tendency to see is what we call lifestyle creep. Right? When we say lifestyle creep, that's really meaning that we spend what we earn. Right? So if I make more money, then I spend more money, and it's this gradual increase of that standard of living, of that lifestyle, that spending over the course of a multi-year period of time as income continues to increase along with it as well. And this is where we see, I think, again, go back to those survey results where we've got so many people saying, hey, yep, I plan on all these different things, but I'm very worried about it because I'm worried about from a cash flow standpoint. Right? Because maybe they were making less at some point in time, and now maybe they're actually over to this period where they're within this affluent type category, or what would be considered affluent for maybe that geographical area or something like that. But they don't feel like it because they've matched the expenditures to what is actually coming in the door.
Exactly. Well, and I think if you're fortunate enough to be covered under a retirement plan, I mean, a lot of the 401ks and all that type of stuff, they do have the auto escalade,
Yes.
which increases, periodically, 1% a year. And I've enrolled probably tens of thousands of people into 401k plans throughout my career. And I've always told them, I was like, plan on, making an increase to what you're saving 1% each year, because I guarantee you won't feel it.
Right.
If you're especially doing it around merit increases and stuff like that. But, even with some of those tools, I still think it would make sense to sit down and assess as your income is growing up or going up a little bit further, is to say, okay, well, I'm saving 7% of my income right now. What would it take to save another, 3% or something like that to my income? Because, if you get a pay raise, your expenditures might not go up by what your pay raise is. And so it might be time to reassess, to say, okay, well, let's bump up our retirement savings at that point in time. And if we do it right when we get a raise, we might not even know that we're doing anything differently at that point.
Well, again, it goes back over kind of it's the opposite of what we were mentioning just a little bit ago. Right, when you're talking about that lifestyle creep, well, if you have that savings creep, that's the good kind of creep, right?
Yeah, it is.
Being able to put that over into place and then not actually necessarily have it impact you from an overall cash flow standpoint, because again, I think what happens with most people, right, and then again, this is just more of a human psychology thing, I would say, more than anything else. Like, we're pretty good about planning in the near term, right? I have a pretty good idea what's going to happen tomorrow. The further that we get out, right, we have more uncertainty, right? Put ourselves 20 years over into the future. I mean, at that point in time, I've got a kid in their 30s. I've got kids in kids in their 30s, kids in their 20s. I don't know. Maybe we still got some in their teens. Who knows at this point?
We'll know in 2 years.
We'll know in a handful of years, right? But my point on that is I don't know who's going to be living at home and who's not. Now, if I've done everything correctly in the way that I think that I have, hopefully not very many of them. But, that's not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination. No. But I have a pretty good idea that when I wake up tomorrow and I start to head downstairs, Hazel is going to yell at me and say, hold me, hold me, hold me. And I'm going to have to go into her room, pick her up, and take her downstairs. Now, I've had to do that for the last 4 or 5 weeks at this point in time. I don't know why tomorrow would be any different. Now, hopefully I'm not doing that when she's, 23. Who knows though? But I think it's just a reflection that, we as human beings, we have a lot better idea on the near term than we do on the long term. And it's exactly the opposite of how investing works. Right. Yeah. So, when we take a look over at investing, I don't know what happens in the next 20 days. No. Right. We don't know. Market might go up, might go down, might go sideways. But if we go a 20-year time frame, I have a very high level of confidence that the markets will increase in value, right, based off of the historical norms that we've seen. And not only do I have that high likelihood, that high probability, we actually have a very narrow range on an annualized rate of return standpoint on what it's likely to be, based off of historical data as well. Now, we don't know for certain, right? But it's actually even a lot more accurate, I would say, compared to, a year over year, like a 1-year style return, on that side, which is always kind of interesting to me, because if you look at the overall prognosticators, they're always looking at it over short time frames. Right? I can remember doing a KCRG segment, a number of years ago, and it was when the Dow was going to hit 20,000. And, it was this big deal, Dow 20,000, all this kind of thing. And I looked over at Bruce Howney and I said, Bruce, you shouldn't be excited about Dow 20,000. Like, it's just a number on there. You ought to be excited about Dow 45,000. And he goes, why is that? I said, well, based off of what I know about you and approximately how old you are, that's about when you're going to be retiring. So you ought to be looking forward to that point in time. And lo and behold, I actually think it was relatively close, actually, even from when he ended up pulling the trigger on that. It was just kind of an interesting thing. So, but we never get those prognostications. Hey, we think that the S&P is going to do X percentage over the next couple of years, and that has an implied value or an implied return of 10,472. It's always, we think it's going to be 6,200 by the end of the year, or whatever that number is. And it's just always wildly inaccurate, for one.
It's wildly inaccurate, and what's the point? It's one of those deals where if you are invested in stocks, you should be looking out 6, 10, 15, 20 years. What it is next year really shouldn't matter all that much. So
I think if you're a momentum trader, maybe. And that's assuming that even if you are a momentum trader and you're a good momentum trader, because most traders, just by and large, are usually not very good at it. It's a very, very slim minority that can actually execute faster than anybody else, because that's the name of the game on that side. And I will tell you that it is incredibly difficult to do consistently. And to be able to predict market performance, I forget what was that number? It was like, and you'll have to correct me on this one, Molly. Maybe you ought to flash that up on the other screen there. But it was like, 8 times 10 to the negative 43 power. 8 times 10 to the power of negative 43% of the time, if you were to perfectly time the market, going back to like 1980 or something like that. It's crazy. Yeah. Like the percentage is so small, it's just incredible.
Well, unless you pull out my crystal ball, and
still
really
on its
cloudy.
way, right? Yep, still on its way.
Yep. Amazon won't deliver it. So.
So, when we look at that again, I think if you look at those merit increases or those pay increases, and especially if you can get over to an auto escalation plan, which those are becoming a lot more prevalent due to relatively recent changes in retirement planning law, especially with the 2020 and the 2022 Secure Acts, when those two were passed, we're seeing those provisions actually added to a lot more plans and being available inside of a lot more plans. So if you have access to something like that, make sure that you're taking advantage of it, as far as you possibly can, because it will help you to get into a position where you're going to be better off. So make sure that you understand those different savings mechanisms that you need. Now, interestingly enough, on something that I just said there, understand what that mechanism is doesn't necessarily mean you have to start there. Okay, I had a conversation with somebody here the other day, 25 years old, and in order to create the level of income that they want, they need to save about $14,000 a year.
Okay.
They cannot save $14,000 a year right now. Okay, I can tell you that right now. And so we walked through based off overall cash flow, based off what they're doing from an overall income standpoint, and how things are actually set up. We're going to start them at a lower number, but we have this plan. Okay, here's where we start. We're going to build you over into this thing over a period of time, where we're going to periodically come back and check in and get you to that number that you need to be at. And so that's really kind of the thing, is understand what those different options are. It doesn't mean you have to start at that number, and you might look at it and say, gosh, that's almost a savings rate of 30% for me right now. Is that realistic? Maybe, maybe not. I think it
Yeah.
depends on the household and depends on the level of expenditures. But don't get disheartened if it looks like an overwhelming number. Just get started and start getting yourself put over into that position and build your way there.
And, you might find that it changes over time too. I think when we're younger that we have grandiose plans of what it is, but then as we go through life and, save a little bit or, that you tend to want to retire on the lifestyle that you've grown accustomed to, so, but
Yep. So really making sure that you understand your income, making sure you understand your outflows, and building in those savings mechanisms over time is the kind of the solution for that.
mhm.
So this number 4, this last option that we have, lending money too often, in
Or at all.
or at all. There you go.
My cheapness is coming out again. So,
I think that, again, this kind of gets back over into, maybe those various different socioeconomic factor things more than it is anything else. When you start to feel like you're actually in a much better place financially, maybe than your immediate friend circle or even your immediate family circle or something like that, there can be a temptation, I'm going to say, for them, as well as you, to either try and be the call it kind of that financial person, or to be able to lend out money and do some things on that side. Now, I'm not saying don't be generous. That's not what I'm suggesting whatsoever. But make sure that you understand exactly what that is. So, it's some of those things that if you are, and I would say probably family relationships, this has a tendency to pop up periodically.
mhm.
Oh, well, you got that really good job and you got the money, so you can lend it to me, and that kind of a thing. And what we have to make sure that we understand is, okay, well, is that actually a loan, right? Meaning, is there actually likelihood that the thing is going to get paid back? Because if not, then it's just a coerced gift. So, what is the actual mechanism from a repayment standpoint? And that's not to say you can't gift it, but walking into the situation, understanding that, okay, well, I'm going to give. Maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's an aunt or an uncle or whoever it is. I'm going to give them a couple of grand rather than I'm going to loan it to them. Really can allow you to emotionally handle that a lot better, and then also be able to factor that into your long-term financial planning as well, right? Because if it is structured as a loan and you're counting on that money coming back and it does not, that can create some other problems, right? And what I mean by that is there a legal obligation to repay that? Probably. Now, are you going to go sue your mother? I don't know. Some people might.
Yeah.
Most people, maybe not so much. They kind of have that familial relationship or that familial tie that they would struggle doing something like that. But if it ends up actually completely and totally wrecking your ability to create financial freedom at some point in time, or financial independence in the future, it might not necessarily be the best thing for you.
Yeah. And I think everybody's a little bit different on this, but I look at it from a viewpoint. I've never had that luxury to be able to go to any family member to get a loan
Mm-hmm.
from them. But bottom line is I do think that you probably would have to look at it as a gift because you're not really a lender, and I don't think you want to put yourself in a situation to where you have to make a decision of whether you sue your mother or child or something to that
Right.
effect. And so um, I just look at it from a standpoint of I just think it's a really bad idea because it changes the relationship a
Right.
little bit, and that's the big thing is
Yep.
if you don't get paid back, or you're being paid back, but then all of a sudden you see the spending that they're doing. Like if I loan my kids money and then I hear that they're going to ACDC concert in Chicago with me, and then Boston the next weekend and stuff
Mhm.
like that, I'm going to start to think, okay, well, why did you need this loan in the first place? You're just
Right.
irresponsible with your money.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, and again, to your point, I mean, that's an emotional aspect of it more so than anything else, right? That
Yeah.
that is even coming back over into whether or not the payments are actually even being made on time.
Right.
Right. So, no, I definitely think there's some issues on that side. Now, the other part of that too is that unfortunately, in especially in family situations, most of the loans are undocumented. What I mean by that is, maybe it's a loan or something like that, but it's never written down.
Right.
Okay. And I see this in the estate planning side, like over and underneath the law firm. This pops up not infrequently. Right. It's
No,
like, okay,
yeah.
so does somebody owe you money? And it's like, oh yeah, I lent my kid, because usually it's kids. At least with the people that I've spoken with about this, I lent my kid, $20,000-$30,000 or something like that for XYZ. And it's like, okay, well, have they made payments? Yeah, they made a few payments and then they stopped. Did you guys ever write it down? No, we never wrote it down. Do they know they still owe you money? and so now, don't misunderstand me. There's some creative ways that we can kind of get around some of those various different I'm going to call them mechanisms, at least in terms of an overall repayment. But what you can kind of run into even over on that is, let's say that something happens to whoever the lender is, right? I lend Scott you $50,000, so to speak. We never document it, and then I pass away.
I like this idea.
Well, my question is, okay, what's my wife going to do now, right? Because my wife now has no documentation that loan ever existed. Maybe we saw some different payments and some stuff like that. So, in order to, recoup that payment, now she's got to come and stand in front of you and say, hey, what was the actual terms of that loan? And boy, I hope you're honest with her.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that's even to say, what loan, right?
What are you talking about?
What are you talking about? That was a gift. Casey just really liked me.
Yeah, he paid me for the podcast.
So it was but I mean, those are the kind of scenarios that does pop up, and that's real world stuff that does not, that's not infrequent. So, I think that especially when we take a look at even outside this lending money too often, make sure you have it documented, right? Have it written down, have it documented, have everybody that is, within that relationship, whether they are whether they're a close family member or they're maybe a little bit more distant, or a friend, or whoever it is, somebody walking down the street, have it in writing, and then also have some sort of mechanism on, okay, well, what are we going to do in the event that this doesn't actually go well? Right, because unfortunately, especially I think this happens in family situations, that the assumption is, well, they'll pay me back, and that is not always the case. And so we want to make sure that there is some sort of a mechanism that, well, if we don't have this happen, then what are the next steps? If we have that in writing, it makes everything a lot easier. And I mean that from an emotional standpoint. You still might not be able to collect, right? That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But it might make things that, okay, yes, we actually already had this hard conversation. So we're not having this new hard conversation while we're still over in this period of financial distress.
Right. And I think the last thing on this is make sure that you can afford it. And not only, from a long-term perspective, I mean, does this interrupt your retirement plans if you don't get it paid off? But then, even I'm thinking on a short-term basis, if I'm going to loan somebody $50,000, but I'm probably going to need to use or tap into that $50,000 6 months from now.
Right.
Am I going to be paid back in time for that? Because there's a really good likelihood that, not being a financial institution, you're not going to get paid on the terms. It's not like you're going to charge them an extra $20 a late fee, for that payment. That just happens automatically, or something like that. But affordability, I would make darn sure that I could afford to be without. And, I think Dave Ramsey talks about, buying a boat is that, but I mean, I would think about, loaning people money. If I could set that on my living room floor and light it on fire, then I guess I could afford to loan that money out.
Right.
So,
yeah, I mean, if you're having to make financial moves, like stop your 401k contributions in order to afford to make that loan, you probably can't afford it. Right. That's kind of what your comment is on that side. Now, if I'm sitting there and I've got, $100,000 sitting in cash in the bank, and I'm specifically excluding that as a retirement planning asset, right? Could I lend $20,000 of that out? Probably.
Yeah.
Right. I probably afford it in that particular scenario, right? If it doesn't come back, like, don't misunderstand me. Maybe I'm not happy about it, right? But it doesn't wreck me moving forward to this point in time. So the affordability piece is definitely, again, I agree with you. That's probably the number one thing. Can you afford it? Before we start even going over through all these other items as well. So anything else that you think, Scott? I mean, just in the number of years that you've been working with people, I mean, I know you've seen a lot of things. Is there anything else that you think would be really pertinent or important for anybody to be aware of, that maybe we didn't necessarily hit on the list?
I think first things first in all scenarios, before you even start making any of these mistakes is, understanding, your own spending habits a little bit and what your personal spending plan is.
I like a personal spending plan.
Just because I hate the word budget, but just understanding that and realizing that you're going to adjust that many times throughout your lifetime, and it factors into some of these mistakes of whether or not you can afford it and how it affects your plan. Because if you grow accustomed to living off of $10,000 a month, just because you retire and now all of a sudden you don't think you're going to have those expenditures, you probably still will, because usually it's because you go out to eat a lot. Well, I'm retired now. I'm going to eat at home all the time now. Your behavior doesn't necessarily adjust just differently with that. So understanding your lifestyle and expenditures is, in my opinion, is probably most important.
So if you're looking for any help with your financial plan or any other aspect of your financial life, whether it comes to developing your personalized spending plan or understanding how your savings plan can actually assist you with developing that, you can give us a call at 1-800-383-6590, or you can email us at contact@premieriwm.com. Just tell the staff on there that you saw the podcast. You want to talk to Scott or Casey about putting some things together for you. We do have an initial consultation at no cost. So we can certainly have a conversation with you just to see what's going on, see if there'd be anything that we could help with. If you would follow Wealth Without Barriers for more content on all the different platforms, wherever this is located, you can definitely see more things over on there. If you have any ideas for the show, or if any specific topics you want to see us talk about, feel free to drop us that line as well. With that, we'll be back next week, and we'll look forward to seeing you again then. Scott, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Securities and advisory services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor, member FINRA SIPC. The opinions voiced in this show are for general information purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, and financial or tax advisor prior to investing. Premier Investments in Wealth Management and LPL Financial do not provide specific individualized tax or legal advice. We suggest that you discuss your specific situation with a qualified tax or legal advisor. Economic forecasts set forth may not develop as predicted, and there can be no guarantee that strategies promoted will be successful. There is no guarantee that a diversified portfolio will enhance overall returns or outperform a non-diversified portfolio. Diversification does not protect against market risk. All performance referenced is historical and is not a guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and cannot be invested into directly. There is no assurance that the techniques and strategies discussed are suitable for all investors or will yield positive outcomes. The purchase of certain securities may be required to affect some of the strategies. Investing involves risks, including possible loss of principal. Consult your tax professional about eligibility to Roth and traditional IRA contributions. Contributions and earnings in a Roth IRA can be withdrawn without paying taxes and penalties if the account owner is at least 59 and a half and has held their Roth IRA for at least 5 years.